To welcome Lizzie Croose today. She's been to the Malvern Group in the past to talk about mustelids, which is her speciality. She's Senior Carnivore Conservation Officer of the Vincent Wildlife Trust, and much of her work has focused on the Pine Marten project, which is the reintroduction of pine martens to Wales and the Forest of Dean. We're very much looking forward to hearing all about the success of this project this evening. Over to you, Lizzie.
Great, thank you. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming, and it's really nice to see so many people. And thank you to Alison for the invite to speak to you all as well. I will just kick off and we can get going. Okay, hopefully you can see that. Okay, great. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, so as Alison mentioned, I work for the Vincent Wildlife Trust. I work on our small carnivore programs. I have spent quite a lot of time working on pine martens, so I'm going to give kind of an overview of our recent pine marten kind of projects and research and conservation work that we've been doing, particularly over the last couple of years. And yeah, very happy to take questions at the end. So please do ask if you'd like any information about anything I speak about. So an introduction to Vincent Wildlife Trust for those of you who aren't familiar with us. We are a specialist mammal conservation and research NGO. We were founded in 1975 by the Honourable Vincent Weir. And our mission is to conserve threatened mammals by leading the way with scientifically sound conservation work. We principally work on bats and small carnivores, so I work on small carnivores, and our work is generally characterised by three key themes, which is developing innovative monitoring methods, population restoration and conflict management. We are actually based, or our head office is based near Ledbury in Herefordshire, so we are kind of geographically close for those of you who are in Worcestershire, but we do work all over the country, and we have staff based in Ireland as well, and we're increasingly working on the continent too. So by way of an introduction to pine martens, they are one of 6 native mustelids. So a mustelid is the weasel family. So we have 6 native mustelids in Britain, which are weasel, spote, polecat, pine marten, otter, badger, and then we also have the non-native American mink. And they are our most arboreal mustelids, so they are the ones that you tend to see above ground, although some of the others, particularly stoats, are very good climbers too. They're usually referred to as a 3D habitat specialist, so they're typically associated with extensive woodland, and they're often kind of considered tree dependent. So even though they'll normally be found in woodlands, they will also occupy some non-woodland habitats, so things like scrub, hedgerows, riparian corridors, kind of rocky, craggy, kind of mountainous areas, but would normally be reliant on some trees in the landscape, and this is largely for predator avoidance. So in Britain, the kind of natural predators of pine martens would be foxes, and then some of our birds of prey, so golden eagle, white-tailed eagle, things like goshawk would take young martens especially. So they spend a lot of time above ground to kind of reduce their predation risk. They are largely nocturnal or crepuscular, so quite active at dawn and dusk, although in the summer months they can be quite active during daylight hours as well. And even though they are carnivores, their diet is actually omnivorous and opportunistic and seasonal as well. So the main bulk of their diet is small mammals. So in Britain, the field vole is their kind of staple, but they do take other small mammals as well. In the autumn, they are very frugivorous, so they eat a lot of fruit and berries, so things like bilberry, rowan, blackberry, raspberry, cherry, and they will take woodland birds and eggs, and invertebrates, and will scavenge carrion as well, so things like deer carrion. In common with them liking to be above the ground, they prefer to den above ground in structures above the ground, so things like tree cavities, or other structures like squirrel drays, old bird nests, windthrow, upturned root plates, or if they're on the ground, they will use kind of cairns or burrows, or even buildings as well. Their home size varies depending on kind of habitat suitability or productivity, and also prey availability, but it's typically in this country is somewhere between 1 and 10 kilometers squared. In Scotland, the highest ever recorded was 56 kilometers squared, so they can travel big distances and can need quite a lot of space. Their reproductive cycle is that they mate in the summer months, kind of July and August, and then they have delayed implantation. So the females don't actually become pregnant until sort of January or February of the following year. And then the young, which we call kits, are born in March, April time. They can have between 1 and 5 young, but 2 to 3 is more typical in this country. And they are very slow breeders. So typically a female wouldn't breed for the first time until she's in her 3rd year. So they're different to some of the other mustelids like stoats and weasels that can breed very fast and have very high litter numbers. So in Britain, pine martens arrived here after the last ice age, like most of our mammals, and they would have been very numerous at the time. It's been estimated that 7,000 years ago, they were our 2nd most numerous carnivore, after the weasel. So it's been estimated that there would have been somewhere around 147,000 pine martens, and they would have been all over the country, because the country would have been cloaked in woodland, so it would have been kind of pretty ideal conditions for them. However, the population went through this very dramatic decline in the 18th and 19th centuries, to a low point around 1915. This was also the low point of some of our other carnivores, particularly polecat and wildcat. And the reason that there are 2 drivers behind this decline. So the first was woodland clearance. So as we cleared a lot of our woodland for agriculture, that was bad news for a kind of woodland specialist like the pine marten. And so when our woodland cover was down to around 5% around 1900, this kind of coincided with the marten's low point as well. And then also predator control. So pine martens have been controlled for game preservation. So things like pheasant shooting and other game rearing and shooting activities, and then they were also hunted for their fur as well. So similar kind of reasons for the decline of our other carnivores as well. So by 1915 they were extinct in most of England and Wales, thought to just be hanging on in parts of northern England like the Lake District and parts of northern Wales. Their only real stronghold was in the northwest Highlands of Scotland, which is where they kind of hung on in reasonable numbers. From the 1930s onwards, a natural recovery was recorded in Scotland. This was attributed to a reduction in gamekeeping pressure. But until recently, there's been no evidence of any natural recovery in England and Wales. So the Vincent Wildlife Trust, we initiated kind of our biggest pine marten project to date in 2014, which is our Marten Recovery Project. And the key aim of this was we were starting to look at, would it be feasible to reinforce pine marten numbers at sites in England and Wales to try to restore viable populations in areas where they have become extinct or were in very low numbers. So we carried out a 2-year feasibility study to look at this. And so one aspect of that was ecological, biological feasibility. And so the key to that was a habitat suitability model. So this was used to identify areas of suitable habitat for pine martens. So because pine martens are a woodland specialist, we were looking for areas of extensive woodland. As with any particularly carnivore reintroductions, which can be controversial, we were also interested in looking at social feasibility. So we carried out community and stakeholder consultation in specific areas to kind of gauge people's views and thoughts on a potential pine marten reinforcement. And we settled on a suitable release site in mid Wales, so North Ceredigion. If anyone knows that area, it's the kind of large areas of forestry, like roughly between Aberystwyth and Llangeurig in the Cambrian Mountains. So when we embarked on the translocation, all of this work followed the IUCN guidelines for reintroductions and other conservation translocations.
Well, that's good.
In 2015, we began the actual translocation phase following 2 years of feasibility work and preparatory work and planning. So we sourced and captured the martens from the Scottish Highlands. And so this is an area where, as you saw on my previous map, pine martens never became extinct. And throughout most of the Highlands, they've been there in good numbers for some decades. So it seemed a suitable source site or donor site, and we carried out survey work to establish and identify the most suitable sites based on pine marten activity at those sites. And then the translocation began in 2015 and ran for 3 years, so 2015, 16 and 17. And in total, over those 3 years, we translocated 51 pine martens. The sex ratio was roughly 1:1. And we had a wildlife vet working with us. So prior to the animals being moved from Scotland to Wales, they were all given a full health check. They were all fitted with a PIP tag, which is a microchip, and also with radio collars so that we could monitor them once they were released in Wales. And then the animals were driven from the Highlands down to mid Wales in kind of an adapted animal van, and initially held for a short period of time in these custom-made release pens. So these pens were built by Chester Zoo, who were a major partner and funder of the project, and they measured 2 by 3 meters. And you can hopefully see in the photo, we kind of furnished them to make them as natural as possible. So with kind of branches and dead wood and vegetation, and they were camouflaged at the release sites in the forests. So this is an example of a pine marten visiting a trap that was set out in Scotland to catch them. This is during what we refer to as the pre-baiting stage or phase. So during this time, the trap is there, and you can hopefully see it covered in grass and moss, but it's locked open. So the animals can get used to coming to the site for food because we put food out, but the traps weren't able to be triggered. So we did that for a couple of weeks, and that increases the kind of visitation rate and the chances of catching enough animals when the time comes for actually setting the traps. And then this is an example of a marten in a release pen in Wales. So you can see it's wearing a radio collar. All of the release pens were fitted with a feeding platform, like you can see here, and they were visited every day and provisioned with food and water. We also fitted 2 camera traps in the release pens so that we could monitor the animals. So that's what this footage is from, the camera trap. And so that we could monitor them to check that they were kind of behaving naturally and not showing any adverse impacts from the translocation. And you can also see in the back of the pen, just under where it says pine marten in pre-release pen, that's the bottom of a den box, which is it's basically the bird box equivalent for a pine marten. So it's a wooden box designed to be the ideal size for pine martens to kind of rest and sleep in. So all of the pens had those, and those boxes are also provisioned in all of the release sites and surrounding woodlands for the martens to use as well. And then when the time came to release the martens after they'd been in the pen for a few days, the door to the pen was propped open, and they were just free to leave in their own time. The pens were kept in situ for a while and provisioned with supplementary food in case the martens wanted to go back and take any. So once the martens were released, they were radio tracked for up to 12 months, which is how long the batteries in the radio collars lasted. So during this time, we were collecting information on where they went to, obviously like how far they spread from the release sites, what kind of habitat they were using, how they were spaced between each other, and getting lots of really useful data. And then before the collars, before the battery life ran out in the collars, the animals were retrapped so that the collars could be removed so that they weren't wearing them, for the rest of their lives. Once the radio tracking was completed, we were then reliant on other methods to monitor the animals and monitor the population. So the main one of those is camera traps. So we've used camera trapping extensively and have had a huge volunteer effort helping with that as well. But also non-invasive surveys, so looking for scats, collecting hair samples from hair tubes, and relying on sightings from members of the public as well. So what we've seen since the translocation, there's been really good survival of the translocated animals, and plenty of evidence of breeding as well. So between 2015 and 2020, we've recorded breeding by approximately half of the translocated females, and we've been able to document at least 38 kits, young martens being born. This total is likely to be higher, but it's very difficult to monitor breeding in the animals once the radio collars are removed. So these two photos here are martens that bred in the den boxes. So these make really perfect sites for breeding because they're secure and insulated. They're off the ground. The females really love to use them. They were initially used in Scotland, and there are a couple of sites up there where martens are monitored, and they breed every year. And yeah, it makes it easy for us to check the boxes in the summer as well for evidence of breeding. And then in 2017, we recorded the first offspring from matings in Wales, as opposed to matings that had occurred in Scotland prior to the animals being translocated. And we've seen since that the population has slowly been expanding north and south from the release area. So here's an example of, this is actually one of the females had 4 kits, which is a really, really good litter size and is rarely recorded in Britain, in the Towie forest, which is south of the release area. So yeah, this female, we've actually recorded her breeding three summers since she was released. So she's doing really, really well. So in 2019, we initiated a kind of citizen science style distribution survey. So again, to kind of get more information on where the animals had spread to, because as the population grows and the translocated individuals are no longer radio collared, it gets increasingly difficult to kind of keep track of where they all are. So this is the kind of minimal distribution in Wales that we have now. It is likely to be a bit more extensive than that. But you can see that in the kind of short time between the releases and now, they've done a really good job of spreading, and particularly north and south, kind of along the Cambrian mountain chain, which is what we predicted they would do. And so we've had 2 PhD students who were working on the project, addressing some kind of key research questions related to pine marten translocation, and kind of what we can learn for future carnivore translocation projects. So the first student, Kat McNichol, who is now managing the pine marten Reintroduction project in the Forest of Dean, her research was focusing on the impact of the pine martens on grey squirrels, which is obviously a topic that a lot of people are really interested in. So part of her research investigated the short-term effects of grey squirrel exposure to pine martens. So to do this, she radio collared grey squirrels in the release area and looked at how their movements were related to their exposure to pine martens, so if they were in woodlands with or without pine martens. And what she found that was the range size and daily distance travelled by grey squirrels increased significantly with increasing exposure to martens, which is a really interesting finding. However, we didn't see any effect of that pine marten exposure on the apparent survival of the squirrels that were radio collared, although it was conducted within a kind of relatively short time period. So it might be that any effect of pine martens on squirrel survival wasn't seen within that time period. And then a second aspect to Kat's research was looking at the movement and habitat selection of the pine martens once they were released. So again, this was done through the pine martens being radio collared and was part of the data collected for that. So part of what we were interested to see was, were there any differences in the movement and habitat selection of the pine martens that were released in the first year, which were released into an area with no conspecifics, so no other pine martens, and versus those that were released in the second year, which were obviously released into an area where there were already pine martens from the first year. And we classified 2 phases of movement in the pine martens once they were released, so exploration and then settlement. And this differed between releases and between both of those years. So in the first release in the first year, when the pine martens were released into an area with no other pine martens, those martens were in the exploration phase for longer. So they were kind of moving around, exploring the landscape for longer than those in the second release, which makes sense because obviously those martens in that first year, they were kind of released into vacant territories, so they had lots of space to move around before settling down. Whereas those animals released in the second year, alongside those released in the first year, they travelled further away from the release sites at a faster rate, but they settled down sooner, but further away from the release sites. So again, that makes sense because obviously they were having to fit their territories around those animals that were established from the first year of the translocation. So yeah, what this kind of shows is that releasing animals in close proximity promotes site fidelity and rapid range establishment. So that's kind of a really key learning point for future pine marten or perhaps other carnivore releases. If you obviously if you spend a lot of time selecting a suitable release site, you want the animals to settle in that release site and not move 300 miles away. So anything that can kind of promote that site fidelity is very beneficial. And then in terms of habitat preferences, the martens released in year 1 didn't exhibit any habitat preferences overall, but within the forest level, they favoured recently felled areas. Whereas the martens released in year 2 did strongly select forested habitat, but didn't discriminate between the forest types. The second element of the research, which was carried out by David Bavin, was more around the social feasibility. So part of this was prior to the translocation going ahead, we did a lot of stakeholder and community consultation to try to understand the perspectives of stakeholders and communities in the project area pre-release. And This was used. This was done using the Q methodology, and we were able to identify 4 perspectives through this method. So one being the environmental protectionist. So these were people who typically had kind of pro-environmental values. They were kind of pro-reintroductions, pro-rewilding, and anti-farming. Then the natural resource steward. So these people tended to be pro-reintroduction, were kind of interested in and saw the value of ecosystem services, had some concern over timber management. And then the cautious pragmatists. So this group tended to be pro-reintroduction, quite cautious, so have maybe had mixed experiences of environmental schemes and felt that social justice was key. And then the concerned manager, so this group tended to be anti-predator, kind of anti-interference in nature, and will deal with problems in their own way. So, you know, if there was a problem with a predator, you know, they would deal with that themselves rather than going through any kind of official channels. And this methodology had kind of proved to be really, really suitable for kind of understanding people's perspectives for carnivore reintroduction in particular, and it will be used for future pine marten and other carnivore reintroductions or translocations. So aside from the research, we've spent quite a lot of time trying to kind of foster community ownership of the project, which was a key aim of the project from the start. So we've been doing a lot of work with local community groups, lots of work with volunteers, and lots of, a part of this is kind of lots of interpretive work. So this, you might recognise in this photo, this is Yolo Williams, who is a naturalist and TV presenter. He's also the patron of the project, and he lives in the release areas or just on the edge of the release areas. And he is obviously a brilliant patron to have. And this is an example of, this is a pine marten sculpture that was created by a local artist and is in the car park of one of the forests where the martens were released. So there's a few examples of this kind of throughout the release area, obviously as a way for people to find out more about the project and kind of really cement the pine marten back into those landscapes and into that area. Similarly, we have worked with the Rydal Railway in Devil's Bridge, which is the village kind of in the centre of the release area. And we worked with them a couple of years ago to restore an old weighing bridge building at the railway station. So it's a very small building which we've basically restored and turned into an interpretive hub for the project. So we call it the Den, the Pine Marten Den. But it has beautiful artwork inside, lots of information about pine martens and about the project. And there's a couple of iPads where you can watch videos about the project. You can, there are actually 2 walking trails that start from there that go into the local woodlands where the pine martens are now resident. You can look out for signs of martens. You can report sightings or field signs, that kind of thing. So that's open in the summer months, and pre-COVID had very high visitor rate. And we've also been doing a lot of work with relevant stakeholders from the start and have continued to through the project. So working with local shoots, shoot owners. That there weren't many shoots in the release areas, but there were a couple. So we've been working with them to kind of advise and collaborate on mitigation measures to reduce any chances of pine martens gaining access to pheasant pens. And we've been working with the farming groups and some local farmers and landowners. So a couple of years ago, a few of us who'd worked on the project, we spent some time helping with lambing at some of the farms in the release area. And also working with other kind of landowner groups and foresters as well. So kind of anyone who has an interest in martens or whose kind of livelihoods might be affected by martens. So following the project in Wales, this led on to a reintroduction in the Forest of Dean in Gloucestershire. So the work towards this started in 2016. This project is actually led by Gloucestershire Wildlife Trust, but Vincent Wildlife Trust and Forestry England are partners on the project. So in common with the project in Wales, it started with a 2-year feasibility study, which aimed to assess whether the Forest of Dean and Lower Wye Valley were suitable for pine martens, both biologically and in terms of social feasibility. And the results of that were very positive. So a translocation reintroduction started in 2019. So using the same methods and the same approach as we had for the translocations to Wales, in 2019, 18 pine martens were translocated, again from the Scottish Highlands to the Forest of Dean. Again, similar to the project in Wales, there's been good survival of the translocated martens and low mortality. And last year, at least 3 of the translocated females bred, which was very encouraging. And then a second translocation of around 20 more animals is due to take place this coming autumn to really kind of secure enough numbers in that population. So this is a video from Gloucestershire Wildlife Trust showing a female marten. So that's her there with the radio collar and 2 well-grown kits. This was taken last summer. So it is proof that one of that particular marten had bred. Elsewhere in England, we have been working in the north of England, which is an area where pine martens were probably not completely absent, but were very scarce for a long time, and have now started to recolonise the northern parts of Northumberland and Cumbria by naturally spreading over the border from the Scottish borders, where there's a marten population. So this project we've been running is part of the national Back from the Brink project, which is a lottery funded project, which is helping to conserve lots of different species and habitats in England with lots of different organisations. And yeah, we've been working on pine martens in the north of England. So the focus of the project has really been establishing kind of the level of recolonisation of pine martens into those forests in northern England. So we've been doing a lot of work in Kielder Forest, which spans the English-Scottish border, and how we can kind of facilitate natural recovery. So it's not a reintroduction. There have been no reintroductions there. And then as part of that, we've been kind of delivering a programme of engagement. So lots of work with volunteers, landowners, again, kind of people who might be affected by pine marten recovery. The video that's playing now was the first video of a pine marten in Northumberland that we recorded in 2018, whilst the beast from the east was delivering lots of snow in and around the project area. So yeah, through this project, which actually just finished in December, we've been collecting the first direct evidence of recolonisation of martens in Northumberland and Cumbria. So the kind of conclusions are that martens are still in very low numbers in that area, but there is a clear recovery underway, and ongoing monitoring will be needed to kind of make sure that those the martens continue to recover in that area. So future prospects for martens, yeah, as I mentioned, they are recolonising the very north of England. Naturally, yeah, this map here is kind of broadly the status of martens now. And as I've spoken about, we have a recently restored population in Wales, which is steadily expanding and doing very well. The reintroduction to the Forest of Dean, although it's early days, there's kind of positive early indication for the population there. Elsewhere in England, there are small isolated populations of martens in Shropshire and in Hampshire in the New Forest. These are kind of unknown origin, but they're certainly there, and they're being monitored. The Shropshire population is being monitored by Shropshire Wildlife Trust, and the Hampshire population by a couple of individuals and groups in that area as well. So yes, overall the picture is positive. It's a lot more positive than it was even kind of 20 or 30 years ago. But pine martens remain critically endangered in England and Wales. And the Mammal Society's recent mammal population review gave a population estimate of around 3,700 pine martens in the whole of Britain. So most of those will be in Scotland. So in terms of, kind of what's next, VWT is currently has been developing a long-term strategic recovery plan for pine martens in Britain. This is to be published imminently by the end of this month. So this kind of paves the way for how we think pine marten kind of conservation should look over the next 10 years, particularly looking at three things. So focusing on conserving the recovering population in Scotland, because even though martens are very widespread in Scotland, that population is technically still recovering. Monitoring and facilitating natural recolonisation, so particularly in areas like Northern England, and then also how to prioritise areas in England in particular for further translocations. So which areas does it make sense for future translocations to be carried out in order to do that strategically, so that ultimately in the long term all of those populations will link up and kind of remain viable. So yeah, that's my whistle-stop tour of kind of the current status of pine martens and the work that VWT has been doing over the last few years. I will stop sharing my screen and hopefully take some questions.